In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up and deploy a custom full-stack autonomous agent using Langchain, OpenAI with up-to-date data from the Brave API. So the tech stack that we're going to be using for this is going to be Node.js and Next.js to build out our front end and server. And then we're also going to be leveraging the new Vercel Postgres database to be able to store the information that we get from our LLM. So we're going to be using the OpenAI GPT 3.5 API. And then finally, we're going to be incorporating the cron jobs from Vercel. So essentially, once this is deployed, it will just run on its own at a specific interval. So as you see here, what I have set up, basically what it's doing is it's reaching out to Brave. It's getting the breaking news for the given time that it's queried. It's normalizing that data, so it gets it within a nice format. It's all strings. We're not passing in extra tokens like a JSON format to the LLM. So we normalize it in a nice format for the LLM. We include the links to be able to have these annotations, so we can link out to the story. So if you want to see, okay, out of the story that it generated, what's the actual news article if you're interested. And then from there, we would also have the option to pass in a character. So say if you want to have the news within the story of Romeo and Juliet or characters of the Lord of the Rings, I'll show you how to pass in a query parameter where you can have that as well as an option. And then finally, once we have that result back from the LLM, we're going to store that within the Vercel Postgres database. So we're going to go through a handful of things. There's going to be a few assumptions here. So hopefully you've worked in Next.js. If you haven't, that's all right, but hopefully you've worked at least in React. So the front end, as you can see, it's not the biggest part of this application. It really is more backend heavy. So if you're comfortable with Node.js, you don't worry about not knowing Next or React or anything like that. You should be able to follow along just fine. And I'll try and cover everything one by one that you need to get this going. So I'll hop over to my VS Code here. And so the first thing that I'm going to have you do, and I'm not going to run this, run every command step by step to show you. I'm going to go through what I've sort of generated here, just so I don't make typos and just sort of for brevity's sake for YouTube. So the first thing I'm going to have you do is create a new Next project. So you can npx create Next app. You'll have this scaffolding. And then the one thing I ask of you is just to match the structure that I have here. So within here, so you'll see within source and app, I'm not using anything here. Instead, I'm overriding everything that's in there. Just remove that so you don't have any conflicts or errors that come up. We're going to have pages, API, generate. This is for our API route. This is going to be what we hit with our cron job. Then we have our index for the actual page that you just saw there. And then the utilities function is going to be the heavy part of this course. And this is going to be where you'll hopefully, if you're interested, be able to go in there, grab the bits and pieces that you need. Obviously, this is a bit of an arbitrary example, but hopefully there are some pieces in here that get the gears spinning on how you could potentially develop something similar or with the type of tech that I'm using here. So one thing to note with this is if you are concerned about cost, so just to give a initial out of the gate broad overview. So for the cost from Brave, I believe it's $9 per, I believe it's 5,000 API calls, somewhere within that realm. There's different tiers you can look at depending on your needs. So very cheap, like pennies for queries, or fractions of a penny per query. And then similar for GPT 3.5. So with the amount of tokens that we're going to be passing in and retrieved, it's also going to be pennies, fractions of pennies to generate these at an interval. Then finally for Vercel itself, so I'm on a trial for the Pro Vercel. You don't need Pro Vercel necessarily, but the caveat with that is if you're going to be integrating cron jobs into your application, you are severely limited on their free tier. So I think you get 1 or 2 cron jobs that execute every day. So, you won't be able to execute something every 10 minutes or anything like that, but you will be able to set up a Postgres database for free. You'll be able to deploy it for free on Vercel, but you will have to make some tweaks if you're really just tinkering around and want to have a hobby project. So you can keep this really, really cheap, like a couple bucks a month if you really limit the API calls, but otherwise, just something to be aware of. So with that, I'm going to dive into the code here. So once you've matched this structure, so the main pieces that we're going to be working in are the pages. So generate index. Within the utilities, you're going to need a .env, and I'll show you all the variables that you'll need. Then from there, we're going to have our Vercel.json. So once you've set up your Next app, if you haven't used Vercel, go ahead and install Vercel. Once you have it, you can just within the command line type Vercel and then go through the options to set up your project. The one piece you will have to go on their GUI for, there likely are ways you could potentially do it from the CLI or maybe even from Node, is to make and instantiate that Postgres database. So we're going to be doing that part. I'll show you where to go ahead and do that from the CLI. You'll need a handful of things in there for your environment variables. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started here. So the first thing I'm going to have you do is open up your package JSON. So once you have this open, you're going to see there's a handful of things that Next comes with, like Next, React, React DOM. I'm going to have you install all of these things above. So I'll just quickly run through these now. I'll touch on them again as we get into them one by one, but we have emotion. So we're going to be just writing some really simple CSS. It's going to be a framework, CSS framework agnostic. So I'm not going to be using Tailwind or Bootstrap or anything. You can go ahead and use whatever you're comfortable with and then just remove this styling after the fact if you want. It's going to be very basic though. Then we're going to have the Vercel Postgres. So this just came out a couple months ago. It's really easy to interact with once you have it set up. But the main part is you just have to follow those steps closely to make sure it is set up properly. And once it's set up, it's a breeze to work with. So from there, we're going to need a body parser. And actually looking at this, we don't necessarily, I did some refactoring from right before recording this, and we're actually going to be making a GET request instead of a POST request for our cron job. So you don't have to include body parser. You could if you end up making a POST request on your server. Then we're going to be using DOM Purify. So the reason why we're using DOM Purify is to purify the HTML that we're going to be setting within our Next app. So we're going to have to be using a method called dangerously set HTML, and sort of long story short, this will help prevent with some scripting attacks with what we have. So that's what we're going to be using DOM Purify for .env, environment variables, JS DOM, similar to DOM Purify. We did a little bit on the front end just to work through having the LLM return us HTML. So we're doing a little bit of a unconventional piece where we're adding HTML into our React. So we are touching the DOM a little bit. And there's a reason for that I'll get into as we go through here. So from that, we're going to install Langchain, and that'll be it. So just npm I, you can do that all on one line. And if you forget something, you should have an error sort of screaming at you in the terminal once you go ahead and run this. So I'll go through the environment variables a little bit and just get you started on what you need. So for the Brave API, you will have to go in and attach a credit card. There is a free tier that you do that you can use. So I'm on the paid version. You might be very limited on the free tier in terms of what you're able to do and the number of queries and whatnot. Then from there, so go ahead. I'm not going to show you like where to get all these API keys. Just do a Google search, Brave API, and then just go through the process, put in your payment information and whatnot. Similar for OpenAI, just Google OpenAI API. Then once you set up an account, you can go to the top right-hand corner, click your initials, and then generate an API key. And then finally, the Vercel Cron key. So I'm going to be exposing this one. I'm going to be changing this after this video goes live. So if you see it, don't feel like you can go and take that and do something malicious with it, because I'm going to be changing it. But that's going to be a key that you set up, so you can come up with a value however you want to generate it and put it here. Then all this Postgres stuff. So it looks like a lot, but we're just going to be copying that from Vercel. So I'll head over to Vercel and just sort of show you what it looks like on the GUI if you're not familiar. So the environment variables, we will have to put both in our .env for when we're developing locally, and then when we deploy, you have to remember to go into the settings tab of the project, environment variables, and one for one include all those values here. So they're exactly the same. And that, yeah, just one thing to note. Don't forget to include these. So this is the part where I'm going to show you the API key. So this is the cron job. So the logic that we're going to be pinging and setting up in a moment, this is the path that it's going to essentially just hit. Every 10 minutes, it's just going to do a GET request, go to the generate route. It's going to pass in the API key, and then we're going to query in breaking news. And like I mentioned on the outset in the video, you can also pass in an optional parameter of characters. So say if you wanted characters like Romeo and Juliet, or Lord of the Rings, or whatever, Harry Potter, whatever you want to put in there, you can pass it in and it will give you an optional prompt. So I'll show you how to do that as well, if you'd like that. And then we'll also be setting up the interval. So well, I'm actually on the cron job. I'm going to hop over here. We're going to go to Vercel JSON, and this is going to be what we have in our Vercel JSON. So pretty self-explanatory. We're going to have only one cron job in this case. You can have more if you want. If you want to do, you can imagine an application where, you have several of these. On the go, so you can have these at different intervals and whatnot. So in our case, this is going to be every 10 minutes. You can just look up a cron generator if you want to say set it every day or every hour or whatever you want. I have mine set for 10 minutes, and then simply we're going to put in the path here and then the API key. So this shared key, just to go over this, just so it's crystal clear, is going to be our Vercel cron key. Okay, so once we have that, if you want to set up storage on Vercel, just head over to the storage tab. You'll see here I have this DemoDB instance that I have set up. And then within here, once you go through and set up the storage, you can go over and just finding where it is here. If you click .env.local, you can copy this snippet and then just paste it right at the top of your .env. So once you have that, you got a Brave API key, you got an OpenAI API key, and then you generate your own Vercel cron. You can sort of close and save out this folder and forget about it. Okay, so what we're going to do first, I think it makes sense likely to go through our utils. So this is going to be the part where I think a lot of people will hopefully find value. You can take these functions and change them and hopefully use them maybe as a boilerplate for what you want to get going. We're going to go through a lot of the different dependencies in this one and sort of the core logic that we're going to need. And these utilities utility functions, you can sort of, they're very portable. So you can bring them over to your application. And so long as you know, have the right environment variables and whatnot, they should work. Environment variables and dependencies, I should say. So, okay, so the first thing we're going to do in the utils is we're going to install the dependencies. So I went over these just a moment ago, but just to touch on them again. So we're going to use the Postgres SQL database. We're going to be using .env to reach into our environment variables. And then we're going to be using a few things from OpenAI. So since we're using the OpenAI GPT 3.5 turbo model, it does have a few extra parameters than their old Text DaVinci 3 model. So there's other things that you can play around with. And I just thought it would be nice to set it up this way rather than just having like one big prompt. So it makes it a little bit cleaner and more easier to tweak if you want. So once we have all that set up, we're going to initialize our .env config. Then in here, I'm going to be using the Brave API endpoint. So one thing to note, I did see as I was building out this project, so Langchain does have a wrapper around Brave. So you could sort of take this function and if you wanted to tweak it and use the Langchain version, you could do that. This is sort of just like the raw API version though that I'm going to be showing you. So within the Brave query, it's going to be triggered with the query that you saw within that cron job there. And then from there, we're just going to be console logging out. So I'm going to be console logging out for a couple of reasons. So one, to show you what's happening and hopefully have you, see as it's running through, whether you're in the development, or you're developing locally, you can sort of see the steps, and if something stops, you sort of know which area to look in. But then also, if there is an issue, once it's deployed, Vercel will log out what you're console logging. So say if on the cron job it logs out, these two console logs, but not the subsequent ones, and it times out or what have you, you'll get a context on what you might need to tweak or adjust. So once we have that, we're just going to encode the query here so it's in an acceptable format. And then we're going to pass in the query of freshness PD. So this will give us news from the past. I shouldn't say news. It's not limited to just news, but information posts from the past 24 hours. And there's a few different options you can see in the Brave API docs. So we're going to set a couple headers. This is going to be how we pass in our Brave API key that we included. Then from there, we're going to establish our query here and actually fetch the data. So we're going to set up a error handling if there are any issues. We're going to return it and make it in a format that we can use within our application. And then from there, we're going to extract the descriptions from Brave. So I'm going to sort of go through this extract descriptions from Brave option really quickly. It's a whole lot of code, but all you sort of the TLDR that you need to know about it is it's essentially taking that JSON and making it with strings and links. So it's think of it as the description from the website and then the link, and it's just like going through and making it and removing all the extra tokens for the LLM. Because if we just passed in raw JSON, we'd have a lot of curly brackets and commas and stuff. So this, it sort of limits our token use, is why we're using this extract descriptions. Okay, so like I mentioned, I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can sort of see the schema that we're going to be working with. It's quite a bit of information that you get just from one query. So another thing to know, we're just going to be pinging Brave once. And this is the neat thing with this. We can get a ton of up-to-date information with the Brave API. And this is just really normalizing that whole response here. Okay, so then from there, we're just going to return that out, and that is going to be what we essentially pass into our subsequent function here. So in here, we're going to say, I'm going to call the function generate fictional story with OpenAI. So not entirely fictional necessarily, but say if you wanted the characters option, it's potentially more fictional. So here, this is where we have that optional characters prompt, like I mentioned. So if you include that characters query in your cron job, so over here in Vercel, and you added a ampersand characters and you typed in your characters there, that will be what triggers this to be passed into the LLM. So once we have that, and just to sort of run through it, well, it's all it's doing is adding include characters from, and you can imagine Romeo and Juliet in the prompt. So we're going to be using GPT 3.5 Turbo. I'm going to be setting my temperature to 0.7. So from what I've read, 0.7 to 0.9 is sort of a sweet spot for creative tasks. But you can dial this down if you want. So by dialing it up, from my understanding, it can take longer with the API. Dialing it down, it takes less time. So if you run into errors with timing, which we'll get into in a moment, you can ratchet this down. Similar to tokens, you can also ratchet that down if you run into issues. So in this, here is where we structure our prompt. So what I'm going to be saying is I want to create a story in a Shakespearean, words are hard, in a Shakespearean style about the latest news. So exclude any mention of news providers and only include information about what seems like current events, and instead write only about news itself that might seem worthy of debate. So hopefully it latches on to stories that might seem interesting. And then from there, you can also pass in your character prompt here. So then I put in some notes to sort of have extra emphasis when it's passed. And I said, pay careful attention to what's below. I want the links to correlate after each news item. So that's going to be how we get that annotation for each link. And then I also specified I want no more than 5 sentences. It's not always going to be exact, but that will sort of help so we don't have cut off responses and have it be, a bit more straight to the point and brevity. And part of the reason for this is, so on Vercel, you do have a timeout on their serverless functions. So where we're going to be querying this endpoint, and you have 60 seconds. So sometimes you will see that OpenAI, for whatever reason, maybe like the GPUs are running hot, or there's just not enough, or whatever the reason is, it can take a longer time to return. So we're going to be passing in a decent amount of data, but we're sort of wanting only a little bit of data back. So I found this as a little bit of a sweet spot. Queries might take about 40 seconds or so, from what I've noticed. Occasionally they do time out, but because we have that cron job, likely you will have enough. But if it's really important to you that it hits every time, the serverless functions might not be the route to go until there's more GPUs online and the API is the speed is reliable from it. Okay, so from here, then we have our human chat message. Then I'm just going to say, okay, here's the most recent news data. Pick no more than 5 of the most relevant stories a user would find interesting. Then that's where we pass in our Brave normalized data there. Okay, so from there, we're going to go ahead and wait for the response. And then once we've got the response back, we're going to return from the response object the raw text from the LLM. And in this case, it's not really raw text because we're also adding some HTML here, which we'll get into on the front end. So then from here, we're going to create our function to create a table. So you could just in one line easily query your SQL database like this. But this I found just useful just to be able to not have to specify that query. And especially if you built out this app and you want to have just sort of standardized ways to interact with your Postgres, you can have these sort of helper functions. But as you can see here, it's super simple to use the Postgres from Vercel once it's set up. So we're just going to set up a handful of these. So clear database as you're building out. So say you're playing around with the prompts, you just want to clear the whole thing. You can uncomment out the clear database and comment it back. This just shows you the SQL to actually wipe that from the database. Then we have the, so this is also a helper. So if you want to initially create the database, so the first time you can create the table. So the first time just run this, then you will have that table created in Vercel. And then this is going to be the one that we're querying quite a bit. So we're going to be passing in our HTML, and then we're going to have our date as well. So this is going to be what we call to render that whole view from our client. And the one thing to note with our client, we're going to set it up in a way so it's only fetching every 10 minutes, which we'll get on into the next part. So it's not going to be every time someone hits the site, there's an SQL query. I'm going to show you how to sort of get around that so you're not running up your database. Then from here, this is also another method that you could use in a few circumstances. So say if you wanted to thread a conversation in the LLM and you wanted the latest response included in the prompt, you could include this within your prompt. And then we're just going to be exporting these to be able to use these in our application. So next, what we're going to do is we're going to go through the generate API. So this is going to be the cron job that we interact with. And this is going to be what runs every 10 minutes or whatever interval you have had set. So from there, we're going to get the shared key from the Vercel cron. So this is going to be to first check to make sure there is an API key so people aren't just querying this endpoint. Then once we have that, we're just going to only allow a get method. So we're just going to send back an error code if you send a post request or anything like that, just as sort of a nice to have. So from there, we're going to extract the required parameters from the query string. So we're going to extract characters, query, and API. Then from there, we're going to verify the API key. So if there isn't one or if it's invalid, it will just throw that error so you know where to look for. So from there, we're going to perform our Brave query first. So assuming all else is good, it will get to the API. It will perform that Brave query. Once it has that query, we're going to go ahead and it's going to normalize within that Brave query. And then it's going to return in a format that we can pass to our generate fictional stories with OpenAI. Then we're going to pass in the characters if they're there. Then from there, we're going to save the response to our SQL. Then finally, we're actually going to also return this to the front end. So if you're in the browser and you just want to play around with that endpoint and make sure it's working, say on production or on dev, you can see the response. So say if there's an issue with Brave or the LLM, you'll see, what information it was fed and whatnot. Then finally, we'll just log out if there's any errors. So from there, in our next application, what we're going to be importing is .env. We're going to be using DOM Purify, JS DOM, Emotion, and we're going to be requiring the get all HTML strings like I just touched on. So I went through these a few times, but there's just some comments here. If you'd like, just to sort of be clear, you can read through them. So this is all the styling that we're going to use. So it's a CSS in JS framework. There's mixed feelings on this thing, but if you don't like this, just rip this out, use Tailwind, use whatever you want. This is just for example's sake. So from there, we're just going to set up our DOM Purify. So this is going to be because we have the A tags within the application. And then from there, we're going to get a static prop. So the reason why we're using get static props is this is going to be what revalidates and creates that static version of the site every 10 minutes. So you can increase this or decrease this as you need. And that's going to be how we limit our SQL calls. So within here, we're going to just do some normalizing. We're going to get the date within a readable format. And then once we have that all set up, we'll pass in our props from our static props here into our front end, and this is essentially all our front end. So these wrappers are our styling. We have our title, we're just looping through them. We have the chapter number, I just have an entry number, but say in a story context, well, you could change out chapter if you wanted. And then we're just going to set the HTML. So once you have it set up, you can deploy it to production. You can Vercel space dash dash prod, that will deploy it to the server. And then from there, you should have a working application that looks just like this. So if you run into any issues, let me know in the comments. I'll put this up on GitHub. You can also open issues there, ask questions. As always, if you found this useful, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. And until the next one.